Greetings folks, I'm Ramwise Gamgee and welcome to Quick and Dirty Roleplaying. In this episode, I'll share what I've learned about one of the major ways that the Japanese play what they call Table Talk RPGs, or TRPGs for short. The impetus for this video was from a segment of Knights of Last Call livestream number 162, where the host, Derek, talks about a response that he received from Emanuel Galeto, the creator of Fabula Ultima, with regard to his scathing criticism of the GM section of Ryutama, a Japanese TRPG that has been translated into English and also provides a lot of the inspiration for the mechanics in Fabula Ultima. In Ryutama, a natural fantasy game focusing a lot on the details of long-distance travel and slice-of-life stories, there exist these beings called Ryujin, dragons with limited godlike powers. The Ryujin are actual NPCs that the GM gets to play as, that possess the power to ignore the rules of the game and steer the plot as they see fit in a diegetic manner, canonizing the GM's ability to fudge dice rolls and railroad the plot. These functions violate what a TTRPG is essentially supposed to be, which is an activity where a group of people take part of imaginary characters in a shared imagined space and can attempt to do anything within their capabilities, the characters, not the players. The rules are there to provide a method of outcome determination that is not subject purely to the GM's whim. The GM is there to adjudicate the rules, to describe the scene, and to roleplay the NPCs. The consequences of the PC's actions in the game world and the implementation of the rules is what causes a story to emerge. These were basically the points that the host Derek brought up on the live stream, where he did a first look into Ryutama, to which Emmanuel responded to in a comment of that video, link in the description, explaining why Derek's take of Ryutama's GM section was very uncharitable. While I won't read the entire post, I will get to the parts that pertain to the subject matter of this video, that being how the Japanese play TTRPGs. In his response, Emmanuel, aka Roosterema2352, states, "I think there are many cultural implications of the Japanese TTRPG culture that unfortunately the book, Ryutama, doesn't present or explain, but once one does understand the context of the game this game emerged from, they make a lot of sense. For instance, it is absolutely normal for people to mostly play one-shots, never meet their fellow party members again, and for the GM to also be a host and facilitator who essentially provides an afternoon of entertainment. So the idea of play to find out is really only feasible for a small selection of groups that play regularly, not for the general audience. These groups need a strong linear scenario and expect it to play like a video game on tabletop, where agency is mostly relegated to flavor, descriptions, and tactical choices in combat. The most concise version I can put this is, the GM worked hard to build a scenario to entertain you for these 5 to 6 hours. The least you can do is play along. Yes, this strongly frames the GM role as that of an entertainer and facilitator, and definitely not an equal member of the group. But in the context of Japanese play, this is simply true. The GM is an event organizer, not unlike in OD&D. In fact, I believe the Ryujin actual progression mechanics is also an act of gratitude towards all the effort they pour into crafting the experience. General Japanese TRPGs also have the GM gain XP by running sessions, which they then convert into XP for one of their characters in the same game. Characters they'll bring into sessions in which they are not the GM. A constant state of crossover episodes, if you will. To provide another bit of context, Okada, the creator of Ryutama, wrote this game essentially as something that could mechanize most of the typical GM procedures, and that would, in a way, legitimate the sometimes heavy-handed GM fiat through an in-world explanation. And hey, if you think of JRPGs, the mascot character who knows a lot about things and acts as the tutorial voice / main quest reminder is fairly classic. Okada's main goal was to make a game that people will be happy to play together at the game cafe, going along for the ride and engaging in little hijinks. And actually, he has now opened that very cafe and mostly dedicates his time to that. Ryutama is actually an open source RPG in its Japan version. As an experiment, I'll flip it on its head. When the Ryujin uses their powers, the players should feel like they have failed in their duties. An ancestral protector is forced to swoop in and sacrifice their own life force to aid them. And at the same time, if the players ignore the scenario or go against it, the GM should feel like they have failed in their duty to provide an engaging experience. This may read weird, but again, this is what I mean when I say that the cultural context matters. A legit criticism in this case is that the game doesn't contain an in-depth forward about this, which would have done a lot of heavy lifting. Sorry for the lengthy comment, but Ryutama is such a unique and strange beast, and I wanted to provide a bit of my experience and insight into running and playing it, as well as some behind-the-scenes information that could prove interesting for you and for any readers in the comments. Hope I managed. For me, at least, Emmanuel did manage to provide interesting insight into this aspect of the Japanese TTRPG culture. I'm not saying that this is how all Japanese TTRPG hobbyists play all of their TTRPGs. From what I've seen, Call of Cthulhu seems to be the most popular TTRPG in Japan, and that game plays very much like a traditional TTRPG in the West, at least to my knowledge. Perhaps over in Japan, the game is played out more like a horror-themed TV show or movie, and the players are just along for the ride as they inhabit the role of the investigators. Yeah, they emote as their characters would, but the story will play out in a largely predetermined fashion, regardless of the player's choices. Another thing to take note of, and was actually mentioned by one of the people in the livestream chat of the Ryutama episode, was that Japan was introduced to TTRPGs via the Western computer RPG Ultima, which was most likely inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, and probably inspired by Richard Garriott's personal D&D campaign, but don't quote me on that. I myself got into the TTRPG hobby as a teenager as a way to have an analog experience to the video game RPGs that I got into during my childhood years. I wasn't required to have the requisite training or resources necessary to make a video game, and the adventure can unfold in a potentially infinite number of ways, something that no single video game can do. In a follow-up post to Derek's response, Emmanuel brings up salient points on how Ryutama's design simply makes apparent many of the practices that don't get acknowledged but typically take place in Western TTRPG groups, simply to maintain the illusion of choice. Quote, it's actually quite funny. Part of me believes what I truly appreciated in Ryutama was that it was so open about the BS that this entire mainstream TTRPG world still largely focuses on. I began respecting it for its sincerity and honesty, and this is a trend in many Japanese TTRPGs. Or rather, it's a trend in Japanese TTRPGs. They don't mince words, they are very railroady, know it and say it. Meanwhile, the games I was raised with were like, we give you adventures that will never work unless your players are a bunch of mannequins, and you, the GM, put in the effort and make our product look good by winging it, fudging rolls, and essentially invalidating any meaningful player decision that isn't what the writer anticipated being proper. So the stark sincerity of Ryutama spelling out that in a game that relies on written linear scenarios, the GM is not an equal participant and they will have to warp events and rules took me by surprise in a refreshing way. Skipping through the Magic the Gathering references, Emmanuel iterates the benefits of running a game in a scripted manner. Games like this allow you to spend your energy during prep at your own pace, and then during the session, You're not actually playing, you're just making sure the scenario resolves and giving it a nudge here and there to make sure that it does. And the players are expected to be helpful cogs in the mechanism, so that they too can relax and know their actions don't have irreparable consequences. Lack of agency is also a liberating sensation for many, and we go back to Fabula Ultima and how anxious people really don't like having to respond to events during a situation. They'd rather nail down a web of expected events and just stick to it. They feel like the game is testing them, which it is, and they don't like that. What does this tell us about humans? I don't know. Maybe that sometimes we want to play the tempo deck, referring to moment-to-moment decision-making in Magic the Gathering, which requires engagement and mental effort, and sometimes we want to play the combo deck. Once again, a Magic the Gathering reference, referring to following canned strategies that produce predictable results, thus allowing folks to abstain from mental effort and conserve cognitive processing power for other abilities. I certainly enjoy running Ryutama for that reason sometimes, when I lack the energy to put real focus into a game, but would still like to mess around with some dice and crack jokes at the table. Is Ryutama elegant in how it achieves this? Probably not. But it's the game that made me realize that there is no such thing as the tabletop RPG hobby, but rather many different games that honestly end up having nothing in common with how they expect you to play them, and many subcultures of people that really shouldn't play at the same table, but feel like they should be able to and can't place why, and can't quite place why. These are sentiments that I've definitely experienced with other people I've played with in the past. They simply want to turn off their brain, roll dice, and enjoy the ride. For me, this is incredibly frustrating, as it ran counter to what I wanted to do in a TTRPG session. Get into the game world as my character, and overcome challenges regarding things I cared about, as opposed to what I was told to care about, in an adventure format. More so than that, it was incredibly disheartening and demotivating for me to run games for people who wanted to play like these aforementioned players, as opposed to players like me. So I stopped running games for those kinds of players. Emmanuel's comment about how there is no such thing as the tabletop role-playing game hobby brings forth a clarity that has been obfuscated by the use of the role-playing aspect of tabletop role-playing games throughout the history of the hobby. There is a contention among certain segments of the TTRPG hobby that want to strictly define what a TTRPG is and what it is not. And the litmus test is whether or not the game's rules and mechanics support maximizing the immersive experience. The more time a player's immersion can remain uninterrupted by the game's rules, or by the GM not engaging in out-of-character communication with said player during the session, the more that game is a role-playing game, and vice versa. The threshold on when the game stops being a role-playing game due to interrupting immersion seems to depend on the individual TTRPG hobbyist in question, though I would sure like to know what the consensus is on their end, if any. For me personally, I have a more lax take on what qualifies as a TTRPG. If I can get into my character, and my choices have meaningful consequences in the game world that stick, I'm playing a TTRPG. I don't mind engaging with systems related to non-immersive elements of the game, such as grid-based tactical combat, abstracted management systems, or limited amounts of authorial control of the world, because I have no problem re-immersing myself back into my character. What I do have a problem with is when I'm spending excessive amounts of time dealing with a system or a minigame that keeps me out of both the narrative flow and of my immersion, because that's where the good stuff is. This includes taking time to properly simulate the world via cumbersome procedures and required external references, such as charts and tables. Strict adherence to the immersion primacy crowd may say that what I actually prefer to play are story games and not role-playing games. To that, I say that I have a preferred way of doing the structured make-pretend hobby, because despite the subtle and not so subtle differences between these various types of games, whether they're strictly analog virtual reality simulators powered by the collective and communicated imagination of the group, a venue for creating stories in an emergent fashion, a way to spice up a tactical challenge via flavorful narrative and description, or a way to simply be along for the ride of an interactive story presented by the GM. These are all different forms of structured make pretend. That's all I have to say about this subject for now. I realize that by including my experiences and sentiments, I've talked about more than simply how the Japanese play TTRPGs, but I felt that this subject matter was relevant to my experience in the TTRPG hobby, and so I wanted to share it with you, the viewer. I also realized that there's been a large lapse of time between this video and my last video. Just to make it apparent, I only create videos on TTRPG subjects that I want to talk about, with no regards as to how it affects my channel's analytics. While I do this as a way of communicating with others, I do this on my own terms and have no expectations of or obligations to anyone subscribed to my channel or for people simply viewing my videos. Last but not least, with the Quick and Dirty RPG system, the Quick and Dirty RPG system is available on DriveThruRPG's website at a price of pay what you want. At this point, I would rather make it as accessible as possible rather than keeping it behind a paywall. I would really like to know what you think of my system, especially after playing it, even if you hate it, so that I can iterate on it with meaningful feedback. With that being said, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. If you wish to leave a comment, please keep it respectful and relevant. With that being said, take care and play to find out what happens, unless you're playing Ryutama.